How much support is there internationally for the per capita idea, the per capita measurement? Certainly China supports it because of its extraordinary population, but beyond that, my understanding that in the developed world, it doesn't have a lot of support.
More and more support for it. And you know where it comes from? It comes from the longer term thinking about an aspirational goal for global emissions, say 2050, okay? And there you're in the world of 2 tons per person, right? For 450 agreement, maybe 3 tons per person for 550 agreement, which is kind of territory that natural scientists, climatologists are really warning us of, okay? And then you say, okay, so 2 tons per person, and we're comparing that to current emission levels of, say, 1 ton per person or so in India, 20 tons per person or so in the US and Australia, 10 in Europe, okay? So now you're already in that world where you're saying, okay, we've got to reduce that to 2 tons per person. Now, why would you, 4 decades down the track, make an argument that countries that currently have a high per capita level should still be allowed to have a high per capita entitlement in 40 years' time? Yeah? Even though they're the ones who are rich and who have the means to actually turn the economy around and invest in all of those low-carbon technologies. Why would you make that argument? So the logical endpoint of any such discussion is to have equal per capita entitlements at some point in the future. And I see more and more acceptance of that, and I do see more and more acceptance of that basic notion in Australia as well, which is a big step because we're the highest per capita emitter, right? We've got the longest way to come down, but there's really no escaping the fundamental logic of that. What the big arguments are over is what is the timescale. Obviously, the longer you drag out the transition, the better for the high emitters because they get to have higher than average per capita entitlements for a longer period of time. Okay. Conversely, most developing countries say that the transition has to be pretty much immediate, right? Or has to take account of historical emission levels, even, right? So that's the heading of historical responsibility, right? They say you guys have been emitting much more than your fair share already in the past, right? And you've lived high on the hog for many, many years, and that's really what's caused the problem in the first place. So we've got to take account of your high per capita emissions over previous decades, maybe centuries even. So that gives you a very, very broad range of interpretations of what a fair target would be, even if you take the per capita principle. And I guess ultimately that's what will have to guide negotiations.
Negotiations aren't about targets alone. Can we talk a little bit about what Australia must do beyond just setting a target that the rest of the world deems enough to help get an international deal?
Yes, look, the negotiations are essentially over mitigation, so that's principally targets, technology, financing and adaptation. Now, something will have to be done under each of those headings. Financing actually, to a large extent, goes hand in hand with mitigation because we're talking talking predominantly about financing for mitigation actions in developing countries. And to my mind, it's really the mechanisms in the mitigation box in the negotiations that will also have to leverage the financing, right? So like we talked about before, successor mechanisms to the clean development mechanism that have better mitigation commitments and also more substantial flows of financing to the developing world. Technology, it's very clear that market mechanisms and targets and trading alone will not be able to drive the technological transition, especially in energy systems, to a sufficient degree, because in particular investment in new and unproven low-carbon technologies has externalities that mean that if you completely leave it to market system like emissions trading, you'll get underinvestment in those. So there's a role for governments to subsidize the development of these new technologies. And again, going back to a proposal that's considered in the Ghana review, you could have a system of commitments, formal commitments by government to put money into the development, research, development and deployment of advanced low-carbon technologies. Okay, you apply that only to middle to high income countries, right? You make it a percentage of GDP. And crucially, you might allow each country to determine the priorities of their spending themselves, right? You don't put it in some big UN fund where some committee then makes political decisions over who gets the money and for what. No, you leave it to the people who pay to determine what they're going to spend it on. So Europe would spend that money on advanced renewable energy, such as, perfecting wind power, etc., etc. Australia, in all likelihood, would go further down the road of putting substantial effort into carbon capture and sequestration, seeing whether that might work, but also geothermal and solar thermal, which, by many assessments are the most promising large-scale renewable options in Australia and ones that need further development. So that's the kind of thing you have there. And as part of that, you might also have a commitment to spend a share of that funding commitment in developing countries to actually put those technologies on the ground in poorer countries. So in our case, we would obviously think of the kind of countries that we're also dealing with in our foreign assistance program. So Pacific, there's a lot to be done in sustainable energy sources in the Pacific, but crucially also Indonesia. There's a lot that can be done in Indonesia on geothermal power. The alternative to that is high emissions, low-grade coal. And I think Australia could have a very positive role to play in helping that transition in our nearest and biggest neighbouring economy.
I'd like to come back to Indonesia, but I guess one of the big questions at the moment is, where is all this money going to come from? There's not exactly a lot going around.
Well, there will be a lot going around under the emissions trading system. Estimated revenue, depending on what carbon price you assume, is $10 billion per year upwards under carbon prices that would truly do something in terms of getting not just the Australian but the world economy towards a lower carbon future. This could easily be $20 or $30 billion per year. That is a lot of money to go around. You would want part of that money to be earmarked to support low-income households and individuals to deal with higher energy costs, inevitably higher energy costs. And we want those energy costs to be higher, but we don't want that to disadvantage low-income households, okay? But you'd only need maybe a third or so of the revenue to do that. And you'd have the rest to play with for technology development and also for transfers overseas. And in fact, under international trading in permits, government would not need to get involved with those financial streams, right? Because you'd allow businesses that are under an obligation to acquit a permit for their emissions, you'd allow them to actually buy that permit in Indonesia or anywhere else in the world, right? And you get those money flows happening directly business to business or business to government or whatever the form may be. So, that money is there. In terms of the technology development commitment, the number we had in the review was in the order of $3 billion per year. So you compare that to estimated carbon pollution reduction scheme revenues, total revenues, so total value of permits of what it is, 12 or whatever billion a year, even in the startup phase. So it's not really a problem in terms of the money.
Yes, there's a big gap between what you're saying can be done with the money and with what the government's proposing at the moment. But I guess you're talking further down the track once we have, hopefully, some sort of international deal where the compensation for trade-exposed industry will no longer be necessary.
Well, that's right. Talking about a situation where we're not giving away a large share of the pie to industries that are very carbon intensive and that have little prospect of becoming less carbon intensive.
Can we talk a little bit about what's happening overseas? You've already said that the US and China are the main players here. They're responsible for roughly 40% of global emissions at the moment. In the US, the so-called Waxman-Markey legislation, led by powerful Democrats, is proposing a 17% cut below 2020 levels. And President Obama has said this is encouraging. What do you read into this? How much are we actually seeing from the US, and is it enough given the leadership that's required of them?
Look, I think what we've seen under the Obama administration is very, very encouraging, because this is happening against the backdrop of a dramatic decline in economic activity there. And, you could have entirely expected any kind of government to put their entire focus on combating recession and setting everything else aside. So this is really good news that climate change and the transition to a low carbon economy is still on the agenda in the US, and in fact is being wrapped into the agenda of getting the economy going again. This is exactly the way we need to think about these things. The low carbon economy as a kind of way to actually restructure the economy and get out of the recession as well. So very positive on that front. Now, as far as the proposals for an emissions trading system in the US are concerned, there's still a live debate over there in terms of taxes versus emissions trading system. That still has to play out, and it'll come out one way or the other. It's not really anything to favour strongly one or the other. The question is really integrity of the design, and to have the whole scheme at a decent level of ambition. Those are the key things. Now, as these proposals are developed, I have absolutely no doubt that they'll run into same or very similar problems of political economy and lobbying pressures, and regional divergence in priorities and interests, as we've seen in Australia and as we saw a few years ago in Europe with the emissions trading system, because you have regions that are heavy in carbon-intensive resources and industries, such as the Rust Belt in the US, right? A lot of coal, a lot of steel, and that kind of thing. It'll be the political representatives from those states that will be asking for exemptions, for special treatment, for free permits, etc., for less ambition, for trade measures to avoid any risk of carbon leakage to other countries, etc. And that will have to play itself out in the US. The difference, though, I guess a fundamental difference to the Australian situation is that the US has a more vital prospect of actually becoming a leader in many of these low-carbon technologies, right? So low-carbon energy could be the next kind of Silicon Valley or computer revolution for the US. So I think policymakers in many aspects, many parts of industry would actually see that as a tremendous opportunity, much more so than we're seeing in Australia. Precisely because they see a chance there to become technological leaders, and that I think will to some extent counterbalance those interests that are there to kind of cement the existing high carbon structures. But the bottom line really is that the US will need to have domestic legislation in place, or just about in place, before they can make a firm commitment on the international stage. That was the mistake with the Kyoto Protocol, with the administration simply going ahead with an international commitment that was never going to get through Congress at that point in time. So I think this time around it's going to be different. There's going to be a sorting out of the domestic mechanisms and legislation in the US first, but that would also quite possibly imply a delay in terms of getting an international agreement, because it's very difficult to see how all of these processes would be worked through in the US in the space of just 6 months or less.
Are you confident they can get what they need to through Congress?
Well, never get what you want, you get what you need. They'll get something through Congress. The question is just what level of ambition it will be, and what the compromises will be in terms of those kinds of compromises for specific industries that we've seen here and also in Europe.
If we get an international deal at 450 parts per million and Australia commits to a 25% cut, can the government's emissions trading scheme reach that target?
Yes, fully compatible with that. What it'll mean is that the price will rise, and that in fact increasing use will be made of purchasing permits and credits overseas, right? So that in fact would in many estimations, make the major effect of going, say, from a 10% target to a 25% target, is that we channel more money into mitigation in other countries, at least in the short to medium term, than we otherwise would have. And that's an entirely valid and useful thing to do for the world as a whole to get on the right track, and for Australia to support that. And what it does for the longer term is to actually signal that a border transition is on the cards for Australia's economic and energy systems as well.
Can we talk a little about China? They've had an emissions intensity target for a little while now, effectively forcing industry to clean up to a degree, at least, and along with other measures. How much is already being done there, and what is the likelihood of it accepting a binding target to restrain emissions growth in a Copenhagen deal?
A fair bit has been done in China already, and just to correct, what they have is an energy intensity target rather than an emissions intensity target. So it's 20% reduction in energy intensity of the economy over a 5-year time span. And from everything that we're hearing, a similar form of commitment might be planned for the period between 2010 and 2015 for China. So the way this is implemented is through various command and control mechanisms, right? So many smaller, older and less efficient installations, both in the power sector and in industry, have been closed down for a mixture of reasons. Local air pollution played a big role in the late 1990s in terms of closing down some of the really old clunkers and replacing them with more modern and more efficient equipment. Energy security is a big concern for China, so they want to be using less energy to get the same services, to reduce the risk of running out of energy in the future. And both of those objectives actually go hand in hand with reducing the carbon footprint of the Chinese economy. So that's really quite positive. One thing that too little is known about in our country is that many of the pricing measures have also been in place in China. So, for instance, there have been export taxes, for instance, on low-grade steel for a number of years now. This is, with the explicit aim of discouraging the domestic production of high energy, high emissions type commodities and products. There's few countries in the world that actually have these kinds of policies in place. But that, of course, is set against an enormously fast pace of economic expansion. And that's, of course, where you get continuing emissions growth from in China. But way forward, clearly I would say for the international community also to actually engage with the kind of policies and commitments and goals already in place in China and planned for the future as well, and as limiting or reducing, in fact, substantially reducing the energy intensity as the amount of energy used per unit of GDP, and also pushing for that energy, of course, to be supplied increasingly through low-carbon sources, more renewable energy. Most of the world's expansion in wind power is taking place in China. More of that, and then you can come to the point perhaps where in the future you could have a formal national Chinese commitment for, in fact, limiting or reducing the emissions intensity of the Chinese economy. And that's really your first significant step towards a binding national target on emissions, hopefully further down the track.
So that's not likely this year?
Look, I mean, who knows? You read and hear about all manner of, talks between the US and China. I think, they're playing their cards, they're holding their cards very closely to their chest. And, a lot will revolve around whether and to what extent the US and China can cut a deal, because significant action in either country is really dependent on the other country taking acceptable action, right? Otherwise, the whole thing will stall. It's really difficult to know just what it will be. I think there's a chance that there will be significant Chinese commitment of some form? If so, then that'll bring a whole lot of other countries along, but there's equally a chance that there will be further delay and only relatively weak commitments. Impossible to tell for me.
I also wanted to touch base on Indonesia briefly, which you mentioned previously. It's the world's third biggest emitter, largely due to deforestation. One of the issues that is being discussed in the international negotiations is a proposal called RED, Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, which dumbed down effectively means the rich paying the poor to keep rainforests and getting credits in return. Can you expand on this proposal a little bit? Is it a legitimate way to deal with this issue, and what impact will it have on a country like Indonesia?
The issue will have to be dealt with as part of an effective international regime to rein in greenhouse gas emissions, and there's some really, really large, very low-hanging fruits there, right? So if you look at these huge estimated emissions in Indonesia, from forest deforestation, everything around it. A lot of that comes from fires in peatlands, right? So these are generally drained swamp areas that are then dried out, and when the rains come too late, forest fires get into them, and you've got enormous emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because the stuff just keeps burning. So that in many cases could actually be relatively easily dealt with by limiting the amount of land conversion in those particular areas that are on peatlands, okay, with relatively small or manageable, in any case, economic opportunity costs, right, in terms of foregone opportunities for agricultural crops or plantations, and or better management of the conversion process where it takes place or where it has taken place in the past, right? So there's a clear role here for international assistance because, again, capacity on the ground is limited, and what's more limited even is the availability of financing and the willingness to bring that financing to bear. I mean, in my discussions with Indonesian policymakers, there's very strong willingness to deal on these issues. Some willingness also to bring Indonesian resources to bear, but very obviously, unless there's a strong financial incentive to actually do so, it won't happen on a really big scale. So, something that has to happen, something like, the estimates are between 15 and 20% of each year's total greenhouse gas emissions come from deforestation, mainly in tropical countries, and the processes around that. Now, it'd be hoping too much to be thinking that you could kind of stop all of that, because a lot of it is for conversion to agriculture, to palm oil. In fact, kind of helping to satisfy the world's growing demand for food. So it'll be very hard to get around that. But, there are degrees and there are areas, there are parts of that 15 to 20% that I think could quite realistically be achieved by getting in place international mechanisms for setting monetary incentives and, in fact, buying out the interests that are there for land conversion at the moment. So for Indonesia, this could be a very large source of revenue, and it could help put forest management and land management and land use more broadly on a more sustainable basis in selected regions. I think it's unrealistic to think that you can kind of save all of the remaining rainforests in Sumatra and Kalimantan, for instance, but the hope would be that you can save some of those forests, and then in particular, if you look further afield to the still existing natural forests, in particular in Papua, Indonesian part of Papua, there's a great potential there, and also an expressed willingness. The governor of West Papua has on many occasions said, look, we'll set aside 50% of our forest estate if we get international financing to help us develop other forms of livelihood, and to allow us the kind of standard of living for people that we otherwise would have gained through the exploitation and conversion of those forests.
Can we just broaden to finish? What are your expectations out of Copenhagen? What will we get?
Probably some sort of Copenhagen agreement, but my guess would be not a finished product. It's more likely to be a very broadly worded political deal about about a future international agreement on climate change, with many of the details to be worked out in subsequent meetings and sessions after Copenhagen. Probably not what the Danish government would want in terms of achieving a Copenhagen protocol to succeed the Kyoto Protocol, but I think realistically, looking at the schedule as it is, looking at the pressures in the US in terms of the time with the new administration having been in only a few months and having to deal with a severe recession there, not realistic to expect a fully knotted out agreement at Copenhagen. At the same time, there's enormous political pressure to come away with something from Denmark in December, and my guess would be that we'll see that, but perhaps with a lot of the detail and possibly including the quantitative commitments and targets to be negotiated in 2010.
Thanks very much, Frank.
Thank you.